Hello everyone, my name is Alexandra Czeglédi. I'm a lecturer in citizen science in the Department of Geography at University College London. I would like to first of all welcome you to this series of online webinars that we organize at UCL and the People Nature Lab at UCL East. The events are funded by the Erasmus Plus project with title Community-Driven Digital Action, a Catalyst for Social Change in the COVID-19 Crisis, or HEIDI in short. If you want to find out more information about HEIDI, our project HEIDI, I will put the link there on the chat area. The online webinars that we organize aim to promote citizen science, hence their title, Citizen Science for All Talks. Each Citizen Science for All event has a specific theme, and we invite world-leading experts to share their knowledge from their specific field of practice and the many years of experience that they've got. So before I move on and introduce today's speakers, I would like to announce to those interested in citizen science that UCL has just set up the first ever MSc in citizen science, which will be available from the next academic year, September 2022. It is a very well organized course to give you the skills that are necessary if you want to follow a career in this continuously growing field, or if you're already working in this field but you require a qualification or a theoretical understanding of the concepts and the methods that are now well established in the field of citizen science. If you would like to find more information about this new MSc course, I will put the link in the chat section. So in this Citizen Science for All event, we will be talking about trust in citizen science data. Citizen science has been recently defined in lay terms as the scientific work undertaken by members of the public with or under the direction of professional scientists and scientific institutions. So the recent growth of citizen science cannot really be overstated. There are hundreds, or I should say, better say, thousands of people who have become citizen scientists and contribute to scientific disciplines without necessarily having the professional qualifications that would be previously required for such an activity to take place. Citizen science not only leads to more data that sometimes wouldn't be possible to collect in any other way, which helps us to better understand our world and find solutions to local or global challenges, but it further contributes to re-establish the currently problematic science-society relationships and re-establish trust in science. Nevertheless, there are a few who still question the quality of citizen science data, and they're wondering how can researchers truly trust the information that they are getting from non-scientists or everyday people. So today we have two speakers to discuss together this issue of trust, or I should better say trustworthiness of citizen science data. We will start with Dr. Amy Freitag from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration at the National Center for Coastal Ocean Science. Amy is a sociologist and the author of the journal paper Strategies Employed by Citizen Science Programs to Increase the Credibility of Their Data. I will put a copy to a link to the paper, to Amy's paper here. And our second speaker is Alexandra Czeglédi, who is an environmental anthropologist from the Environmental Social Science Research Group. And in her talk, she will share experiences and the theories of how trust building in citizen science project is working within the Hungarian context. During this webinar, Ali Shepard will be live tweeting the whole event, and you can use Twitter to post your questions, or you can use the chat area here to post your questions, and Alice will transfer them on Twitter too. Due to the limited time that we have, we will be able to only take one or two questions at the end, but the speakers are happy to answer your questions on Twitter, or you can directly email them. Thank you very much. And Amy, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Let me share my screen. All right, so I titled the talk the same thing as the paper because that's why I was invited, but I'll delve a little bit more into some other research before and after that paper was generated, and that was in 2014, so now getting a little long in the tooth. But I'll start my talk with saying sort of the punchline, which is, why should you trust citizen science data? Well, because generally speaking, every program that I have met thus far works really, really hard to make sure that their data is trustworthy and communicate why. So delving into, there we go. That said, I'll start with that. What are the goals of citizen science? It is not necessarily trustworthy data. It often is, but not always. And so when you talk about trustworthy data or the quality of the data, there's a whole host of words you might use there. Every citizen science program that I've encountered, they've openly discussed that data quality, steps they've taken to increase trust and quality of their data, but importantly, remind you of the program goal. And here in the United States, and I think this is true in a lot of other places, a lot of programs focus on education. And so the data quality or the scientific use of that data might come secondary, and they'll be open with you about that. And so what you see here is reasons that are from a meta-analysis I did in 2008. So talk about a really old study showing some examples of program goals for environmental-based citizen science, which is a subset of the broader field, obviously. That's mapping species distribution. So getting at those things that Artemis introduced, you can just get different types of data. Increased stewardship of the environment, in particular restoration, getting some baseline data before something like restoration occurs, and tracking trends over time are some of the reasons these programs existed. And they talked a lot about making sure that their data was good enough to meet those goals. So trustworthy enough to get thrown into court, or to write a paper on it, or to educate the students who are out there, if your goal is increasing stewardship, to get them excited about the environment. During this study, we also did a meta-analysis of the literature for exactly what the recommendations are from existing programs for success in meeting those program goals. And you see that they're listed here with the percentage of papers that mention that thing. When you directly ask people, you'll note that it's similar but different from what the literature said. People are, I think, a lot more honest face-to-face than they are writing a formal, stuffy academic paper. But things like collaborations, that's big. That's big with trust building in general, outside of science, but obviously science is part of life. But things like having a consistent methodology, a good standardized training program, and a way to present that data out to policymakers, but also to the wider world, and communicate. I didn't word it this way at the time, but communicate exactly what you're doing out in a structured way so that people can understand not only that the data is quality, but the steps that you took to get to that point. The other way that people talk about data quality, this is sort of a chicken or egg, is it's a matter of data ethics and integrity. And so at least here, there's been a number of federally enforced scientific integrity initiatives, and data quality comes up at the very top of those conversations. Well, how do we get scientific integrity? We do that through really structured quality data that is defensible. In some cases in court, we're highly scrutinized and a lawyer can pick it apart and it still stands, for something like water quality, where you're litigating a company to clean up their mess. A lot of citizen science groups contribute to those sorts of things, and they're at the very pinnacle, I would say, of data quality. They must be, because it has to stand up to that scrutiny. But taking a step back from that, it is a matter of ethics. And on the flip side, if you ask people in the citizen science community, and this is, I've put a couple of screenshots here from a study by Elizabeth Jones at North Carolina State, and I will drop the links to that in the chat after my talk, about ethics in citizen science and how are you ensuring that you are an ethical program. Data quality comes up as one of the very top concerns. And people talked in great detail about how they achieved that. But suffice it to say, it goes hand in hand. Data quality is a matter of ethics and integrity, and people take that as a core part of their identity to make sure that they communicate that outward. I should also say that these folks are putting together a little toolkit for each of their topics that you see here on data practice to for citizen science programs to use. So if that is of interest to you, I'd highly suggest checking out their website. So on to the reason I was invited. Let's delve into a case study of the California marine protected areas. So California, the west coast of the United States, the largest chunk of our Pacific coastline here in North America, established a network of around 40 marine protected areas. They're kind of small in the global sense of how those work. And they are actively, the groups out there were actively encouraged by the state to be the monitoring arm for the state, essentially, to go out and collect all the data that they might need about these marine protected areas with the question of, do they work? Should we keep funding them? Should we try some other strategy in our coastline? And part of what they wanted to know was, in this, do they work, is can we pick up the signals we want, like from a scientific point of view, but also, do people trust this data? Can it go to court? Can it uphold the law that protects these protected areas as MPAs? And through a series of focus groups and then a workshop, we directly asked the citizen science groups that were taking all this data, well, what are you doing to actively increase your credibility? What are you doing to make sure that the state believes your efforts? And they divided a whole host of activities into kind of 3 buckets of when. And they said you needed to address data quality at least one way in each of these times. And one is early action. So when you're planning the program, inviting people to the table, setting up all of your protocols, planning your field season, all that kind of good stuff, you have to have protocols in place to address data quality then before any science actually gets done. The second chunk is in the field. So what are you doing to make sure that mistakes aren't made, essentially? And finally, in the office. So when you get all that data back and you're starting to sort of analyze it and work with it, then what do you do with it? And there wasn't a clear winner, interestingly, across the different groups of you need to do this. There's no recipe book for making it data quality, but they did say you have to do a number of things at these different times, probably more than one in each of these categories, and communicate that out to your data users. In this case, it was the state, but in other places, it might be someone different. So I'll go through a couple of examples of the types of things that they mentioned. This is in order of that scientific process. So project and volunteer initiation, things like a test or a training period to make sure that people know what they're doing. Scientific advisors, so mix and mingle with actual PhD scientists, and hopefully you'll pick up on some of their strategies. And over in the example category, don't feel free to not read all the tiny words. I copied this out of the paper, but those are example programs that existed in the state. So if you're curious about actual details, I highly recommend you look them up. In that second stage, this had the most options, I would say. The data collection, how do you make sure it's going well? And I will say that some of these volunteers were literal kindergarten folks out with their teachers, and some of them, most of them, realistically were retirees, but a full spectrum of needs and capabilities and all that kind of good stuff. Groups they were really creative. Some had a ranking system where you sort of got certified at higher levels, and once you achieved a certain level, your data was considered good to go. Lots had in-person oversight. If you're in the field in person, that was easier. Some had retraining, making sure like continuing credits that people have to take for their jobs. And a lot had technological aids, which are, I would say, since the study happened, increasing in frequency because AI is so good. Artificial intelligence, if you're asking people to report pictures or data directly from their phones, you can get a lot of background QA/QC happening on the phone before the data gets recorded. And then finally, after the data collection, this was largely done by the scientists themselves who led the programs, or program coordinators, not by the volunteers, but things like validated observations, making sure you have more than one person looking at it, comparisons across time or different places, actually getting it published, so that peer review process put to work. Management use often has a peer review step as well, or an actual quality assurance protocol. That was particularly true for the water quality folks because the EPA here, the Environmental Protection Agency, requires it, but it's a good program and other people have stolen it. So at the end of the day, I want to take a step back. The point of the California program was to connect to management and make sure that their data was useful for managing MPAs. And I put together a little schematic here of what people were doing to sort of actively cultivate a relationship with the data users, management in this case, the MPA managers. And I put it on a scale. Think of these as axes of deliberate or serendipitous. So like some made a very structured process that they wanted to just jump in and architect their relationship from the very beginning. Some it sort of happened over time and they got what they got. Similarly, sometimes it was a cooperative relationship and sometimes it was adversarial. So you can picture environmental action groups, they wanted to take the state to court, and that's how this relationship started, versus cooperative, meaning we really want to support these MPAs and make sure that they're successful. So we'll do whatever we can to get them on the ground. And here you'll see some examples of how people did that in sort of the various quadrants. But suffice it to say that I would say a lot of the folks who had sort of these serendipitous relationships could look back and say, well, this worked and this didn't. Would I do it the same again? You'll note that there are no adversarial relationships by accidents, which is good, I guess. If you're going to make an enemy, do it on purpose. The rest were trying to get a lay of the land and what structures were in place and what meetings were you going to together and what part of the actual management process was that data contributing to, making sure that you could directly meet those needs and the data standards associated with those needs. Was it going to court or was it going into a scientific document? So that requires a different levels of data scrutiny, I should say. So that kind of wraps up the California example. Like I mentioned, this paper is not fresh. And so I'd like to end with some thoughts from what I call the other side. I now work for one of those management agencies. The National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration here in the States has a series of marine protected areas. And I would say that I am now more of a data user than an analyst of it or a producer of it, which I was also in a different life. And looking at it from that perspective, from a person who's sort of inputting that data, things have come across my desk of late, and we are currently including citizen science in our strategic plan to increase the use of citizen science moving forward. So I've tried to capture a few ideas from our strategic planning conversations of late. One is the importance and responsibility to the situated knowledge of the volunteers themselves. It often comes up in the United States as, well, tribal knowledge is protected and it needs to be included as a matter of diversity and inclusion initiatives and making sure we're not helicopter scientists. But also that people in the world can bring a lot more to the table than just a single piece of data. And we need to make sure that we respect that knowledge and elevate it to management at the appropriate level. So that's just a warning. It didn't come out in California as much, surprisingly, as it does in my life now. Second, Artemis brought this up, the spatial coverage reaching communities from a national perspective, we couldn't do work without community level engagement, without the volunteers. And so, yes, it's about highly resolute spatial data that volunteers can bring, but it also allows us to make decisions at the scale of human life, at the scale that people live in, not at the state level, which is, to the rest of the world, the size of a whole country. Third thing, these are a little bit not in order, so I'm not naming these 1, 2, and 3, but the importance of metadata. Some groups are much, much better at writing out exactly what they did and describing how this data should be used or how they want the data to be used than others. And I very much appreciate the groups that give me really a book of what their data is, how it got there, and particularly the cases they would like it to be used for and not to be used for, because I don't want to take someone's data and do something that they wouldn't want it to be used for, if that makes sense. And finally, and this gets back to that stages thing, is the statistical techniques of what do you do once you get the data? And that goes a little into the metadata. What can you do with the data given its uncertainty, or are there zeros? If people went out and looked for a bird, do they record that nothing happened? Not always, as it turns out, but there's a whole host of statistical techniques that can help make that data even more useful. And that's where the heavy policy wonk scientists like myself now sit in. Can we take this data in? Can we take the data from multiple groups in multiple places and tell a much broader story than any one group could do? And so there's some math that helps that happen. And I will just end there with a thank you. A little infographic from NOAA of 6 ways to be a social scientist and the ways, the big programs that we have. So if you're interested in looking those up, and then contact information. My personal website has all of my papers. So if you're curious about the case studies, feel free to go find them there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Amy, for a very, very interesting talk. I suggest we continue with Alexandra, and then at the end, we take a few questions. But if you do have any questions for Amy, either post them on Twitter or here in the chat area. So for those who joined the session, after I introduce the two speakers, I will remind you that Alexandra Czeglédi is an environmental anthropologist from the Environmental Social Sciences Research Group in Hungary. Alexandra, over to you.
Thank you so much, Artemis. Thanks for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. First of all, because I'm gonna present partial research, what I did with my colleague Balázs Bálint, and I hope that this research gonna be reaching out more and more people in the future. So I'm sharing my slides, just a second. And first of all, because research on citizen science in Hungary and all in Eastern and Central European countries is quite little at the moment. And I believe this is one of the first mapping research that we have done with my colleague in the recent months, in the past 2 years, actually. And within this research, we will look at specifically the question of trust, just for this talk for today. So we basically screened our data to see how our interviewers thought about trust in the Hungarian citizen science cases. So I would focus on broadly on the question of trust. And I would like to present shortly ESSRG before I move on with that. So about ESSRG, as you see our logo here down there, it's the Environmental Social Science Research Group. It has been mentioned before about me as well. And we are in the crossroad of environmental and social science researches. We quite often generate knowledge through co-creational methodologies, and citizen science is one of those methodologies we prefer to use and adopt in our research processes. And we also have expertise in stakeholder engagement. In the past few years, we developed these skills with our colleagues all together. And we also founding member of EXA. I guess some of you have already known the European Citizen Science Association, and you work closely with them. So this is one of the threads we pull through this association to strengthen citizen science in Hungary. At the moment, we have ongoing research project within UCANT, Youth Citizen Science, you might heard of, and we just closed one of the greatest citizen science project, the EU Citizen Science, where we have started to develop this research I'm gonna present today. Before I move on to the details of the research, I would like to shortly talk about the context of Central and Eastern Europe. When we look at citizen science, I think it's quite important to to think how it evolved in the past few years and why we see these results in the interviews. First of all, there's acknowledged unequal knowledge production between Eastern and Western Europe, which basically means that the former Eastern Bloc and state socialist countries has different history and relationship to science than the West has today, which is first of all would be defined by the invisibility of citizen science in these countries. Invisibility does not only refer to the fact that it's under-researched and not really coming forward as an innovative methodology at the moment, but invisibility because of the term that we use. Citizen science is not a widespread term yet, I would say, in the post-socialist countries, including Hungary. But we also find other terms that is more frequently used by the community or local researchers. For instance, community science or participatory science, and so on. So these are the terms that try to hide the citizen aspect, probably for historical reason, and rather focus on a community or certain group of people who would do science altogether. While in other contexts, community science and citizen science means completely different stream of participatory research, I would acknowledge. But in the case of Hungary specifically, these terms are interchangeable. Also, I think it's important to mention, before I go on with the details, that the dominance of positivist methodologies and predominantly quantitative methodologies are still present in Hungarian social sciences and natural sciences. And it somehow comes with a certain hierarchy that's sometimes not that easy to dismantle. And what I mean by that these hierarchies are coming with the position of the researcher, while participatory methodologies are overlooked by those researchers who stick to their methodologies and agendas in this positivist science making. Participatory action research is quite a growing community at the moment in Hungary, mostly from the regime change from the early 90s. These projects have started to evolve. We have a couple of cases that we haven't looked at yet, mainly because they haven't defined themselves as citizen science, or they close themselves from this term or these communities. They consciously advocate themselves as PAR researchers that should be distinctive from the citizen science communities. So about the research, what we have done with my colleague Bálint Balázs, just shortly to introduce the methodology, I would say it was a semi-structured interviewing process. And our basic idea was to map citizen science and community science initiatives in Hungary. First of all, because as I mentioned, so little has been done before, or it's not an overarching research to understand this context. So over the past years, we reached out to about 30 research projects, some of them led by Hungarian ministries, most of them embedded in universities and state finance research institutions. It's also quite common that these projects are led by PhD students, and they have some extra funding for that, or they just do it as a volunteer work. We also have some NGO project that coming from rather the participatory part than the research approach. And we have some individual project which means some enthusiasts started to do a research on their own, and they built a certain community around themselves. So most of the research, I think it's not surprising. Also in Hungary, it's mostly about environmental science in the field of biology, ecology, and agri-food systems or urbanism. And social science research is only 10% that we can find in the field of citizen science. And mostly these fields are from archaeology, sociology, or data science. So we had one main, quite loose research question, I would say. How do these projects work in Hungary? Since these are emerging projects and quite new, in the past 2-3 years, we see them growing as small little mushroom in a wet, healthy forest. It's really difficult to catch up with this development and to gather information about these local projects. So we decided to have a basic research question to map the actual situation and to see how these projects are growing at the moment. Of course, we were also interested how these projects contribute to democratization of science. How can they build trust in the society, and how researchers trust in the data itself, or if there's a lack of trust that it might be more common in the Hungarian context. So to gather more data about trust itself, first we look at the question on data quality and management. We look at the question of funding as well, and we also look at the question of how behaviors are changing over time. So these are loose questions. We're not necessarily focused on trust, but trust appeared as a main theme in the research. So we concluded that, first of all, trust is quite fragile in the Hungarian context. There are several reasons, as I mentioned, some historical reason that state was very strong and bottom-up initiatives were not quite common before the 90s, before the regime change as well. And the whole structure of science making is quite hierarchical. So fragility in trust is a big issue that these projects that we interviewed try to deal with it in a way. So first of the problem they're facing is challenging authority and academic hierarchies. Some researchers, mostly in state-financed institutions, they don't see the point of opening up the doors and starting participatory projects. As it was mentioned before me, the very basic idea is that they can't trust, or the quality of data won't be good enough as a researcher would do. So challenging expertise, it's also something that they have to face when they set up a citizen science project in Hungary, especially in state-financed institutions. Co-creative methodologies can challenge expertise. It has been said by project managers and researchers that their colleagues look down upon the research methodologies brought on the table, especially if it's participatory one. So it's a constant negotiation that they are doing at the moment. And also the question of ownership, it's something that they had to discuss with other researchers and with the volunteers. So the question was always coming up, who's owning the data, who has the right to publish? They always under pressure to publish the latest research, and they have to decide if they want to include the participants, the volunteers, or it's just for the research institution who's going to publish. These are, again, goes back to the problematic hierarchies of academic research that they are facing these days. Competitiveness, also there's a competition that, who's going to publish the results, as I mentioned. And these are the main point that researchers shared with me in the interviews. And at the same time, they also dealing with these challenges. But while they pointed out these weaknesses and challenges when they're doing citizen science research, they also mentioned why is it important to trust in citizen-generated data. I think it's also not surprising when these researchers shared with us that cheap and affordable large-scale data collection is the most important part of citizen science research. Most of the institutions and researchers are underfunded in Hungary, and the only way to gather large-scale data is to make it affordable and keep the cost low. And this was basically the main argument. They started a citizen science project on their own or with the support of their colleagues and other institutions. And the other argument that came out more predominantly was about communities. Once they built a community of volunteers, they managed to gather trustable data. They managed to have quality data that they can use in the research. And also they could cooperate with volunteers over time in publications and informing other trainings for volunteers. And the other theme that came out was the legitimizing research process. It was very important for most of the researchers to make their research interesting, popular, and visible. It wasn't quite common before the citizen science project that they communicate their research and their methodologies widely. So they see citizen science as an opportunity to make their position stronger in the society and make themselves more visible. And by this, building a community and make it stronger. Bottom-up advocacy is also important, but mostly this theme was important for bottom-up organization like local NGOs and community of civil society. They simply acknowledge that the only way to gather good data is to recognize that people know better. If they are in the field, they're gonna share quality data with us. We have to provide tools and certain knowledge, but people already know from their daily experience how they face these problems of environmental pollution, air pollution, or water pollution and other damage in the cities, for instance, in the streets. I brought some quotes just to illustrate how some of the interviewers think. For some of them, nothing has changed over time. They still think that the amateurs, in other words, the volunteers, are not always reliable. But to improve this situation, they have to bring a strong controlled situation and precise rules on the table. And this way they can gather much better data. Another researcher shared with us that education became more important than the data itself. They already managed to reach a point where they trust the data. They managed to build a website where people can enter the exact information they need and it's gonna be a quality data for them, and they can trust in this process. But over time, education became much more important. And what came out also very important in the research is how to gather trustable data, how to reach it. If someone starts a citizen science project, they were sharing more information about that than about trusting data already. First thing that came out, I think from all of the interviews that I was reviewing now, that they recognize they have to change the role of the researchers. They have to learn new skills. This is something that they haven't thought of before starting a citizen science project, or maybe not in this manner. Most of the researchers has to become a curator, a project manager, facilitator, educator, and most importantly, also science communicator. I think these information are not quite new for many of you who listening me at the moment, but for these researchers who are coming from a hierarchical academic institution to open up the door and start participatory research project, these are quite new skills that they started to develop on their own, sometimes without help of the institution, as their communication officers are not at help in these processes. So researchers themselves became these facilitators, science communicator, curator, and they have to adopt different roles. It's just a short quote here. One of the researchers shared that he thinks himself as an introvert person, and before he having started to communicate to people, he was rather spend time analyzing data next to his table, and he started to reach out people through Facebook. That was one of his strategy to gather quality data. Also, how to gather trustable data over time. They shared that institutional support and trust in citizen science itself is very important. If they don't have support from their colleagues and the institution itself, that would be a very challenging environment to proceed with the research project and reach out to volunteers. Also, funds are very important in order to build an adequate infrastructure. Most of the times, mobile apps are not available. Most of the project has a website, or if they don't have website, they have just a short description just circulating on Facebook or other social media platform. They realize they need to organize trainings when they're doing this research and edit educational materials. So all these require funds that sometimes they are short of, and that's why they adopt different kind of roles to try to pitch in here and there. And they also mentioned they lack sometimes available technological support. When they have it or they learned it by themselves, they manage to reach out to more volunteers and people. So they mentioned that in communication, there should be an innovation. They see themselves as innovator within their own environment, especially because they find topics that connect them to the participant, to the volunteers at emotional level, and they build the communication campaign around it. One of the projects I would mention is roadkills. Roadkills collecting data on small mammals, those that were hit by a car on the main roads and highways. It looks like that it became one of the most exciting projects in a way in Hungary. Over 600 data arrived to this researcher, and they succeeded in gathering enough data to quality and trustable data to manage the research over time. And when I talk to other researchers about different topics in environmental protection and monitoring, they also mentioned that those are the most successive researches that has some emotional touch on the participant. Also, they realize they have to dedicate more time to educate the volunteers, or at least keeping in touch with them in person, which is quite challenging when it's an overwhelming project. But it happened quite often that researchers keeping in touch with volunteers via Facebook groups, where they explain further what they want, how they want the data back from them. And there's a direct communication, which is a bit different when there's a mobile application or other tools helping them gathering quality and trustable data. Transparency is also very important to reach quality and trustable data over time. They realize they have to include citizen scientists, volunteers in the publication process, in the analysis of results, and they have to communicate their results over time. Also, one other theme that came out was about adjusting the research to local needs. I would mention UCount as one of the big European funded research, where adjusting local needs is very important in order to gather quality data. We managed in UCount add different questions to the mobile application to be more sensitive to the local cases, whereas it's about environmental inclusion or social inclusion or any other cases like focusing on refugee communities. Standardized question doesn't work in most of the cases, so it needs to be adapted over time. Toward more trust. These also from the research, and I would say that the National Research Development and Innovation Office in Hungary doing a great work at the moment. It's quite recent, they have adopted the theme and principles of open science, and they regard citizen science as part of the open science machinery that they try to implement at the moment in Hungary. They encourage local researchers to apply for funds and adopt open access and open science principles, including citizen science. Whereas they look at citizen science as a communication tool rather than a participatory methodology. Also, I would say international projects are very useful for local researchers to see the benefits of citizen science, to learn from other researchers and exchange their experience and adjust these knowledges to the local environment. I just shared some projects which are ongoing or just closed this year. That was very beneficial for local researchers, the GROW Observatory, EU Citizen Science or UCount, and also reinforcing bottom-up initiatives to build more trust in the community. And this way they could generate trustable data with researchers over time. One of the initiatives is Passerby Researcher, ESSRG, our organization also working on Passerby Researcher to provide a framework, a website for local initiatives to gather data and research themselves. And also University of Pécs in the southern part of Hungary, providing mentoring for local researchers to set up a good standard citizen science project. And also trainings are important to sharpen these new roles or innovation of the researcher roles, as they pointed it out. And I would mention Sticky Dot as well, that one of the organization provided training also for us at ESSRG. These are skills that not necessarily coming with the researcher skills, and it needs to be sharpened before someone starts a citizen science project and they want to gather reliable data. And I would like to share the resources I used if you would like to know more about citizen science in Eastern and Central Europe. And thank you for your attention. And if you want to access ESSRG, you find our website here on LinkedIn. I would be happy to share it in the chat as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was a very, very interesting presentation for trust, but also for the points about the inequalities in knowledge production and the European context with respect to citizen science that you mentioned in the beginning. We would like to thank you all, especially our speakers, for the very interesting talks. I hope it was very as eye-opening as it was for me, for everyone else. And thank you all for joining today's session.